1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Ukraine. On October 14, 1962, 60 years ago, when many of us were about 15 years old or a little older, an American U-2 spy plane spotted Soviet ballistic missiles being installed in Cuba so that they could be fired into the United States 90 miles away. On October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy went on TV to tell the world that Nikita Khrushchev had planted missiles in Cuba. And that the US was using Navy ships to impose a naval quarantine on Cuba. Khrushchev threatened to sink US ships if they interfered with Soviet ships going to Cuba. Both presidents placed their militaries on alert. JFK demanded that Khrushchev withdraw the missiles. So some background. The US invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs had failed in 1961. The US was trying to oust Castro. In November of 1961, the US established Operation Mongoose, paramilitary operations designed to overthrow Castro and Cubanism, communism, with economic warfare and sabotage. Then on August 23, 1962, JFK issued National Security Memo number 181, a directive to engineer an internal revolt that will be followed by US military intervention to take over Cuba. And a speedboat strafed a Cuban seaside hotel, killing Russians and Cubans, and some sugar shipments were contaminated. And Operation Mongoose provided a timetable for the open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime in October. So why did Khrushchev ship nuclear missiles to Cuba? Well, one obvious reason is he wanted to defend his ally from a US attack. And he wanted to show the world that Russia had achieved nuclear parity. Some background. Nikita Khrushchev felt vulnerable to a US first strike nuclear attack. Khrushchev had only 20 unreliable ICBMs. We had 284, plus 2,000 nuclear bombers. Overall, the US had a 17-to-1 nuclear bomb advantage. Khrushchev wanted to change the balance of terror so that we had mutually assured destruction, known as MAD. Khrushchev delegated the authority to his field commander in Cuba to fire their tactical nuclear weapons if Cuba was invaded. That was exceedingly dangerous. No one should have the authority to fire nukes all by themselves, not even a US president. So what happened? JFK threatened the entire USSR. Quote, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." End quote. On October 27, 1962, what happened was the most dangerous moment in human history. Near Cuba, a US Navy destroyer was bombarding a submerged Soviet submarine that was armed with nuclear torpedoes. The submarine needed to surface to get oxygen, but the depth charges were rocking the submarine, keeping it down. It really got hot down there. The oxygen supply got curtailed, and crew members began to faint. They thought war was breaking out. 2 of the 3 submarine commanders ordered the crew to get ready to fire the nuclear-armed torpedoes. One of them said, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." But it required all 3 of the commanders to agree to fire the missiles. One of the 3 wanted orders from Moscow. He refused to give permission to fire. A guy named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. Now, let's look at JFK's top 10 actions. President Kennedy accused President Eisenhower of a non-existent missile gap that favored Moscow in the campaign for the presidency in 1960. JFK went on to win the presidency, and he won a 15% increase in Pentagon spending, and he accelerated the building of nuclear missiles. JFK consulted Ike, who preferred military action to isolate Havana. But JFK set only one goal: remove the missiles, even though the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to also get rid of Castro. Curtis LeMay wanted an all-out war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff all recommended an immediate airstrike on Cuba. JFK deferred a decision. Marine Commander David Shoup cursed him. JFK did ratchet up the alert status of our nuclear forces. 66 nuclear B-52 bombers were constantly airborne. As I said, Kennedy promised full retaliation against the Soviet Union if just one missile was fired from Cuba. JFK initiated discussion about pulling our US Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. JFK sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to give Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin the threat on October 27. If you don't commit to remove those missile bases out of Cuba tomorrow, we will remove them. JFK ignored a more recent demanding letter from Khrushchev and answered an earlier, less aggressive letter, pledging not to invade Cuba for the removal of the missiles. Most importantly, JFK made an implicit reference to the removal of the US missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev later wrote that he saw Kennedy as one who sought solutions through negotiations. On Sunday, October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that he was withdrawing the missiles. Within 6 months, all the missiles were removed from Cuba and from Turkey. Decades later, Khrushchev's advisors revealed that 43,000 Soviet troops had been hiding on the island to defend the missiles in case of an invasion. JFK was right. If the US had attacked, he would have started a war with the Soviet Union. Now, a look behind the scenes with U Tant, the Secretary General of the United Nations. U Tant asked Presidents Kennedy and Khrushchev for a moratorium on the conflict at sea. He proposed the Soviet missile withdrawal from Cuba in exchange for the US agreeing not to invade Cuba. He went to Cuba to calm down President Castro. Then, back at the United Nations, he aided the Soviet and American negotiators on how the removal of the Soviet missiles was to be verified. The UN leader, U Thant, is an unsung hero. One outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the US and USSR created a telephone hotline between the White House and the Kremlin to facilitate communication during a crisis. Another outcome was probably JFK's June 10, 1963 speech at American University, entitled World Peace, one of his best speeches. He said that total war makes no sense because it releases worldwide deadly poisons. He said that we must be aware of distorted views of Russian leaders. He said that we must halt the arms race and make the world safe for diversity. He called for, quote, general and complete disarmament, unquote. He took the initiative. Get this. He took the initiative. He said the US would no longer conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere. And the Kennedy-Khrushchev cooperation gave impetus to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of August 5, 1963. But there were some other outcomes. The Soviets refused to accept US nuclear domination and opted to invest whatever was needed to overcome their inferior position. They achieved rough nuclear parity by the early 1970s. That ensured there would be mutually assured destruction as the consequence of a US-USSR nuclear war. In turn, MAD caused the US to put more of our taxes into paying to regain a first strike advantage. Plans for fighting and possibly winning a nuclear war emerged as too tempting to pass up. Nuclear arsenals swelled beyond numbers previously imagined. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara argued that a reasonable goal for fighting a nuclear war with the Soviet people would be killing 25% of the Russians. That's 55 million people, or 6 times Michigan's population. At the beginning of our 21st century, only 51 US strategic warheads would be needed to kill so many people. But the US arsenal numbered over 10,000. More outcomes. Americans learned a faulty lesson. Khrushchev blinked. Only JFK and 6 advisors knew about the secret deal to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, because if anyone found out, they would smear JFK as an appeaser, and he might lose the next election. Politicians, war planners, and Americans were thus led into falsely believing that the lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis was to stand firm and threaten the Soviets. But the crisis passed because JFK compromised. Nevertheless, most of us believe the US forced Khrushchev to back down because of threatening him. The US practice of preparing and threatening to strike first with nuclear weapons was reinforced. So the US and other nuclear armed nations have threatened to fire nuclear bombs over 40 times. And neither the US nor Russia have renounced the right to fire nuclear bombs first. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed 8 key drivers for building nuclear warheads and missiles. It's all about deterrence. The deterrence of a nuclear attack by building more nukes. They say deterrence prevents nuclear war, they say deterrence prevents war between nuclear powers. But look at Ukraine. We are closer than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis to a nuclear Armageddon, as President Biden has stated. They say deterrence is necessary to reassure allies, but those nuclear bombs make the Europeans nervous. They say that any move away from deterrence is destabilizing. To the contrary, only a policy of no first use or requiring more than one person, one president to launch weapons, that's the only way to bring security. They say that nukes deter large-scale conventional attacks, but look at Ukraine. They say that nukes deter chemical and conventional attacks, but look at Iraq, Syria, and the white phosphorus in Afghanistan and Iraq. They say that nukes confer status and prestige, and they do. And they drive non-nuclear armed nations to get nuclear weapons. They all want to join the club. They say that nukes cost less than conventional arms, but consider the health costs in making and testing atomic bombs. Finally, they say that nuclear weapons need establishments to maintain the expertise. But the result is that nuclear arsenals across the globe are set to grow in the next decade for the first time since the Cold War ended. Finally, a good outcome. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King saw the Cuban Missile Crisis as a time to connect nuclear disarmament to racial and economic justice, to take some of the billions of dollars spent on nuclear devices to increase teachers' salaries and rebuild schools. Let us not misuse the success of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but instead strengthen the country by granting African Americans the right to vote, eliminate the poll tax, and end the system of segregation. 20 years later, in 1982, at the United Nations, Coretta Scott King declared, "All of our hopes for equality, justice, economic security, and a healthy environment depend on nuclear disarmament. But we have ignored the prophets." We have had the bomb on our minds since 1945. It was first our weaponry, then our foreign policy, and now our economy. Prophets say nukes are our supreme idols. So now, who has nukes on their mind? The 9 nuclear-armed states have the bomb on their mind, and they continue to modernize their nuclear arsenals. Nuclear arsenals are going to be growing over the next 10 years. Russia and the US possess over 90% of the usable nukes. And the numbers add up to a nuclear winter. Smoke and dust clouding us into virtual darkness for months, creating radiation sickness, destruction of crops, food scarcity, hunger, famine, fights over food. The United States plans to replace the 400 Minuteman ICBMs with new Sentinels. There's only one bidder for these new Sentinel missiles, so it's reasonable to expect the cost to go up. A Sentinel missile is as tall as a bowling alley. And these missiles will act as a sponge in 5 states to draw in Russian ICBMs to soak them up. Possible better names for the Sentinels, they are Money Pit Missile or Omnicider. And there's an ICBM coalition in Congress that lobbies for them. Military contractors have donated over 1.2 million to the 6 and 15 million to 64 members of influential committees. We have these huge nuclear weapons makers. Here are the top 5. They make huge profits off American taxpayers like you and me by building doomsday new nuclear bomb-carrying missiles, bombers, and submarines. These profiteers from building nukes are some of the largest donors to members of Congress. And these profiteers from a future Armageddon have employed 380 lobbyists in 2020. But there are some good guys. 122 countries voted in 2017 to approve the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, despite heavy pressure by the US not to do so. As of August, 68 countries have ratified the treaty, so it is now in effect. Now, nuclear weapons are illegal. Kim Bergier, in the Michigan Stop the Nuclear Bombs campaign, lead us to demonstrate every year on January 22nd, the anniversary of the treaty going into effect. We show people driving up and down Woodward Avenue and Royal Oak, nuclear bombs are illegal. These hugely influential group of mayors represent 1,400 US cities that have populations over 30,000. In August of 2021, the US Conference of Mayors unanimously passed a resolution calling on Washington to embrace the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons. US mayors want to rid the world of nuclear weapons and use the taxes saved to save our cities from broken bridges and roads. Climate scientists know that the US military is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Climate scientists know that even a limited nuclear war will spew dirt into the sky, block the sun, limit agriculture, and cause millions to starve. Climate scientists doubt the US Navy and Army can get their greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero by 2050. Climate scientists have committed civil disobedience to demonstrate their slogan, no warming, no war. Headquartered in the United Kingdom is a group called Scientist Rebellion. Hear their novel proposal. How about canceling the debt of countries in the global south in exchange for those countries keeping fossil fuels in the ground? Nevertheless, what's reality? William Perry, former Secretary of State, says the Ukraine war is a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists nuclear doomsday clock, oh, and there goes my clock, is closer to midnight than during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, only 100 seconds away from midnight. President Putin says that Russia may use a nuclear weapon if it faces an existential threat to its country, which now includes eastern Ukraine, according to him. Biden says that the US would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the US or its allies or its partner. Neither nuclear power has ruled out the first use of a nuclear weapon. Both countries conducted exercises in October to fight a nuclear war. Fears of escalation have mounted. The US Army's light infantry unit, the Screaming Eagles, trained to deploy on any battlefield in the world within hours, is ready to fight. It's been deployed to Romania, only 3 miles away from Russia. So how can President Biden respond to nuclear blackmail? He can tell Putin the US will not use nuclear weapons under any circumstance. If Putin uses even one tactical nuclear weapon, the West will redouble its supplies of conventional weapons to Ukraine. Our president could say the economic sanctions on Russia will be bolstered by a complete embargo. It sounds like Kennedy's quarantine of Cuba. And he could say that Putin will be indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, and that a warrant for his arrest will be issued. Deeper into reality. What's the probability of Putin firing tactical nuclear weapons? We now know that in October, senior Russian military leaders had discussions without Putin how and when Moscow might use a tactical nuclear weapon. Those discussions worried US officials. On the other hand, there are no signs of Putin putting nukes into a position to fire on Ukraine. And there are no significant nor large military targets in Ukraine. And if Ukraine is part of Mother Russia, as Putin says, then why would he want to bring massive destruction and death on his own homeland? It's good that the Chinese president and German chancellor have condemned Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons as irresponsible and dangerous. Both oppose the use or threat of nuclear weapons. And it's good because both China and Germany have some ability to influence Putin. Nevertheless, Putin's attempts at nuclear blackmail require proactive diplomacy. We must recognize that US security does not depend on NATO enlarging to include Ukraine and Georgia. France, Turkey, who helped the grain shipments start, the UAE, Qatar, and the UN have all been suggested as mediators. Even India and Israel have signaled an interest to mediate. But most of all, there needs to be a groundswell of support for negotiations and a truce. On October 17th, a Monday, 30 House Democrats wrote a letter urging President Biden to talk to President Putin. But they got so much negative feedback, they withdrew their letter on the next day, on Tuesday. Diplomacy is not popular. But look at the common sense in that letter. Biden should, quote, pair the military and economic support the US has provided to Ukraine with a proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire. That letter was not an extreme request. And after all, JFK resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis by combining military toughness with tough-minded diplomacy. We can't forget about economics. The World Bank says it'll take at least $345 billion for the reconstruction and modernization of Ukraine. Well, how can we afford war and a Marshall Plan? Kevin McCarthy, who could be the new Republican House leader, has said there will be no more money for Ukraine. How can we rebuild Ukraine if that's the case? Well, Congress could tax the large fossil fuel profiting companies and the profiteering military contractors. Congress could pay farmers to produce more grain for the world. Most importantly, long range means building solar and wind capacity in a new Ukraine. Still, reality. Winter is coming to Ukraine. the capital Kiev and its 3 million people face a winter with no heat, water, or electricity. So, what might get Putin to a ceasefire negotiations? Are there off-ramps? Well, if the nuclear exercises are still going on, NATO could cancel them. The US could declare that NATO will not accept Ukraine as a member and will relax some sanctions on Russia if Putin honors a ceasefire. Ukraine could declare it is a neutral nation and agree to UN-mediated elections in the Donbass region. Zelensky has said he will only be open to negotiations once Putin is gone and there is a new Russian president. It's been reported, however, that the US recently, privately, asked Zelensky to show he is open to negotiations in order for Ukraine to be on high moral ground. And so just yesterday or today, Zelensky has announced 3 conditions for negotiations. Russia must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia must compensate Ukraine for damages. And Russians accused of war crimes must stand trial. Those are probably non-starters for negotiations, but finally, there is some public talk about diplomacy and negotiations. And remember, we are the good guys. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dean Rusk reports, I argued against the surprise attack, pointing out that world opinion would turn against us because we didn't first try diplomatic avenues. President Kennedy worried about an adverse public reaction, including demonstrations and peace groups in the streets, perhaps a divisive public debate. People power, that's you and me, we must demand diplomacy now. So here's the ask, the possibility. Dial 202-224-3121 3 times. Tell Senators Peters and Stabenow and your representative, who might be Andy Levin or Alyssa Slotkin or whoever, tell them we need direct talks between Presidents Biden, Zelensky, and Putin to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. Tell President Biden to do diplomacy. Pick up the phone for direct talks with Putin and Zelensky. NATO and Russia must talk. The US and Russia must talk. Zelensky and Putin must talk. And this is the best tactic that I know of. Dial 202-224-3121 and demand that there be direct talks to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. That's my presentation. I'll be glad to hear some comments or questions at this point.
Thank you. A very informative, interesting talk. And if anyone wants to write something in the chat box, I think everyone knows how. And you just clicked on that little arrow next to the chat there, that little up arrow, and then you can write something. Let's see. And if you want to raise your hand, let's see here. You can raise your virtual hand if you have a question, or your actual hand, whichever you would prefer. So let's see, I'm gonna get a view here so I can see everybody. There. Okay, I see Chuck Kessner has his hand up. So Chuck, you have a question? You're muted. You have to unmute.
Thank you, Tana. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I enjoyed your presentation, and I concur with you that negotiations are the only way out of this. And I'm very concerned about where it's going. But currently, scary. I been listening to a lot of people talk about what you're talking about right now. And it seems to be that we seem to be acting as a country, we act unilaterally. And, you know, and multilaterally, we don't seem to do that. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can encourage that also. You know, it seems like, you know, we've just got out of 20 years in Afghanistan. You know, we're in Syria, we're in Yemen, we're in so many conflicts, you know, and it seems like it's like our way or the highway. I don't know if it's the State Department or what, but I don't know if I'm asking too much or this is not, but I'm wondering, I think the conversation, you know, we don't seem to act multilaterally anymore. And I'm wondering if somehow we can bring that conversation up too, or if that's part of the problem also. What's your thoughts on that, Rich?
Ironically, the most multilateral cooperation is right now between President Biden and the European NATO countries. Boy, they are all on the same wavelength of fighting and humanitarian aid. And so we need Germany and Great Britain and France. We need to act together for the sake of negotiations. The United Nations is an underutilized body, and for humanitarian aid, as well as mediation. The Secretary General Gutierrez has been trying, and we need to support that. We need some neutral mediation probably. And it's just amazing that some countries, like Israel, who's tried to remain neutral, some countries have offered to mediate, and we need to take advantage of that. Yes, we need multilateral work, and there are possibilities. Let me just share that when we go to a Detroit Tigers baseball game, and we're Tiger fans, they almost always recognize a U.S. service member and have that man or woman stand up, and people stand up and applaud. One of these days, I want to go to a Tigers game and see them commend a State Department official. Let's put the praise and priority where it belongs on the peacemakers.
Okay, we have some comments in the chat box. There's a question by Powers, Mary and Jim. Is it Jim? Yeah, Mary and Jim Powers. David Mary Powers. They want the phone number in the chat, and Mary Ann Gonsier put the phone number in the chat. So does everybody know how to go to the chat if you want to copy down the phone number to the Capitol switchboard?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. And you can use that phone number Monday through Friday, regular hours. And all I have to say is, please connect me to Senator Stabenow, and it works. I have sat in what was then Representative Peters' office one time, and we were waiting to talk to Representative Peters, and we must have sat there 20 minutes, and the phone never rang. And I thought, wait a second. People ought to be calling up and emailing our representatives all the time. So I encourage people to do that. The last I knew, on Monday mornings, Senator Peters' office reports to the whole staff the number of phone calls and emails on various topics. They add up. They really do. And I want to comment on Bob's comment. he commented that JFK's American University speech could well have been a rationale for his assassination. Very, very likely possibility. And I would recommend that you all find and read Kennedy's American University speech. Like I said, some say it's his best speech, most worldwide relevant speech. So I recommend Kennedy's speech. And of course, I recommend Martin Luther King's speech on Time to Break the Silence about Vietnam. We have a really good history of good perspectives in those two speeches.
For sure. Rich, you can also see JFK's American University speech on YouTube. If you just look it up on YouTube, it's there. So
very good. Yeah. Yeah, I'm also, I have to admit, I'm partial to that because one of our sons went to American University. And there's well. Maris, unmute yourself. Good to see you. Good to hear from you.
Well, I've got two comments. The United States is behind, I don't know how many million in support of their dues for the UN. Our use of the veto in the case of the country, the apartheid state of Israel, has been used in the Security Council 52 times since Israel was a state in 1948. The last vote, I believe, on the blockade of Cuba for the last 60 years, 185 nations in the UN voted against the US blockade of Cuba, and the only state that voted with us was Israel.
Just two nations.
2 against 185. So the concept of getting more diplomacy when President Biden will not use any public diplomacy against the bombing and killing of Palestinians that's been going on over since 2008, 2009, there have been 5 attacks from the sky using drones, killing infrastructure. There has not been one sanction, not one public statement. And he and his administration and his Secretary of State, Ned Price, is it? I can't, spokesman, they are not to be trusted. They do. And then when Biden went to Saudi Arabia and fist bumped with MBS, who had the freedom of the press that's supposed to be our bedrock institution that we believe in the United States, and MBS was acknowledged by our intelligence service that he was behind the order for the killing and the dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. We have yet to see his body. We have yet to find his body, but we certainly wanted oil or something on the price. We as a nation we are what you would call not respected by the rest of the world with our treatment and sanctions against Iran, Russia, and calling Russia doing international crimes against humanity. And we believe Amnesty International when they investigate the crimes in Bucha in Ukraine, which is wonderful that they're there doing that. But when they will not speak out, our media will not speak out about what Israel has been doing with a crime against humanity. And they apparently believe that it's okay for them to commit crimes against humanity because they are, quote, so-called a democratic state. I don't know that anybody complained when they kind of boasted it, that Israel will take care of Iran and we're okay with that if we don't have a new deal, which our government got out of, which was the with 6 other nations, and it wasn't Biden, it was Trump. But on day one, when Biden took office, he had an ability to reverse getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, and he chose to listen to whoever he needed to listen to, probably Netanyahu or whoever was heading up Israel, because they're the ones that didn't want us to get in the nuclear Iran deal. And we are still not back into the Iran nuclear deal when we're the ones that pulled out of it. And all we did was re-sanction Iran. If we are people of our word, we would have got back in on day one, just like what we did with the Paris Accords. Why? Why didn't we? Why still aren't we doing? We're listening to, for some reason, and maybe somebody can tell me what it is, why we are not ethical in regard to what the Israeli government is doing. When they want to go over to Iran and they boast about it, and they took out all this material. I mean, are you all aware? Did you hear that on your news? Whenever they don't like something that's going on in Syria, or they don't like, they go and just bomb them. They interfered just like we interfered and attacked Iraq in 2003. I don't get it. And until we disassociate or act the same way to Russia, that's committing international war crimes, we should be asking for Israel to be investigated. And we should be asking, why are they not part of the nuclear deal? They have refused to sign it, and we're not allowed to talk about it. Apparently our government isn't. Where is the peace movement on holding what Israel is doing accountable?
So Rich, can you respond to any of her questions?
Well, in terms of the last comment about the peace movement in Israel, Peace Action has a good position, but we don't do very much lobbying about it. I think for me, one of the best sources for information about the plight of the Palestinian people is the University of Michigan professor Juan Cole, an informed comment. I see you nodding. I mean, he really.
And he's no longer going to be, he's going to automatically do stuff on Twitter. But since Elon Musk took over 6 days, we're not going to hear his voice.
Yeah. So, get on Juan Cole's informed comment daily.
I'm already there. and so are the Quakers. The Quakers are lobbying all the time. They're doing something. They're talking to the Congress people. They're giving the citizens actions because it's a crime. And we're giving Israel $4 billion, the most that we give any other country.
And Maris,
A
now
year.
that the election is over, and now that voting day is over, and now that our Peace Action of Michigan Peace Builder event will be over on Sunday, we're ready to do something, and I have to admit that I lost the email from you about you had recommended an action a while ago. We were postponing it until now, and I've lost it. So please resend it. Please resend it to me.
Here's the deal about sending these letters to our Congress. They have been bought, and now the AIPAC has given money to Republicans that are less progressive than the Democrats in certain states. So the action, our government, we got to skip the Congress. It's the State Department has not done anything about investigating the death of Shireen Abu Akleh, the press representative that was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper, May 11th, 2022. And President Biden refused to meet with her when he went to Israel. And he didn't meet with the family when the family came to Washington, D.C. There's 6 human rights and civil societies that have been declared terrorists by the Israeli government. And our government still, the European Union said there was no proof given by the Israeli government, and they are funding the same 6 that were called terrorists. But our State Department is still studying that. It hasn't come out with declaring them that Israel doesn't have a leg to stand on. And
Okay. Thank you and appreciation, but I want to see if there's another voice or two we can hear.
I have something to ask you. It seems to me like it would be difficult for Biden to negotiate with another country right now, because if a Republican gets elected, they can just take back like anything he negotiated. Now that Twitler just backed out of the Iran deal, and there's just so much division between the two parties. It doesn't seem like another country could count on any deal made by Biden being followed by a Republican administration.
Well, I think that is a danger. If I were Biden, I would say to myself, I'm not going to run again. I've got 2 years, so I'm going to do what's right. So all I can be responsible for is making the best decisions and the best deals in my last 2 years. You got nothing to lose, President Biden, go for it. That would be my humble advice.
Great. Anyone else have any comments? Let's see, anything else in the chat box? There's somebody, yeah. Oh, Colleen has her hand up. Yeah, you're muted, Colleen. You want to unmute?
Well, thank you so much, Rich, for putting this together. And I like the way you connected, 60 years ago with now, that we're still dealing with the same thing. but I listened to JFK's speech, June 10, 1963, and this was my favorite quote. Actually, I think I sent it to you, Rich, but you didn't put it in your presentation, so I'm going to read it. Kennedy said, above all, talking about all this nuclear stuff going on, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. There's no way we're going to get Putin to be humiliated. We have got to have the diplomacy, the diplomats that are really educated in negotiations. And you can't have a nuclear power, you know, that's threatening tactical nuclear weapons. I just heard about the difference between tactical and the strategic nuclear weapons. And, you know, there's got to be, the only way it's going to be solved is diplomacy. And I felt very sad that, you know, Representative Jayapal backed down with that signed document because it was not radical. It is the only way we're going to end this mess is through diplomacy or complete destruction of a country, both countries actually. So, you know, I know we've asked, we met, our Michigan Peace Alliance met, Rich and I and all the other members of different groups met with Senator Peters. And I thanked him again for, you know, supporting that Iranian nuclear deal initially. And I sent him another letter asking him to do the same thing now, fight for diplomacy, get the Iranian nuclear deal back. I mean, to me, that's top priority. And it's the only way we're going to end this is through negotiations, diplomacy, and not backing Putin into a humiliation that will not succeed. As I think we all know that. So I never got a reply, by the way, from Senator Peters this time. Did you send a letter after our talk, Rich?
I made phone calls.
You called, okay.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
But I
but
think,
it's very
you know,
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, like I said, elections are over. It's time for everybody to go to work. I mean, politicians are always fearful of being accused of being appeasers. Well, and so they lay low during the election cycle. Well, that's over. It's time to get back to diplomacy.
I agree. I hope we can do it. And talking to mayors, are you still here, mayors? No, she left. Oh, mayors, if you're still here, I do believe they are still negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal.
Yeah, Bob
So-
Podzakowski wrote in the comment about that. He said the United States and Iran are negotiating resuming the nuclear deal and appear to be getting close. Israel is fighting it tooth and nail. This is per the September update by the Arms Control Association.
Yeah.
So thank you,
Thank you.
Bob, for that.
And plus, while I have my open mic, congratulations to you, Rick, for your Peace Award, and Kim Bergier, another member of Citizens for Peace. Many of our members are working the polls. They're volunteers. And they'll probably have some interesting things to share with us about today. So we've got committed people, and you know, I agree. We can I can give it to Tata, and she can send it out how to get that call in. And you know, your voice will be heard better now after the election. So let's all try to do that. We'll send the information. So congratulations, Rick, Rich, and
Thank you.
also Dr. Fred Pearson. Have a wonderful time Sunday. You
Thank you.
deserve it. Yeah.
Yeah, Linda Leader is one of the people working at the poll. She sent me a text yesterday. She has to
And
work.
Jen and Donna Jean and I think Kimberg, a bunch of us are working. So
Okay. And there was another suggestion that Bob Podzakowski made. Where is that? Oh, I'm looking. Is it gone? Oh yeah, maybe they could honor Colleen at a Tigers game instead. And
I'll be there.
Great idea, and I'm a fan. I really am. I'm a fan. Always have been. Go Tigers next year.
You
What
throw
could I
out the
do?
first pitch sometime.
Oh my gosh, I missed the whole thing.
then is that
Oh, there we
Bob
go.
Frank who said honor a Peace Corps member at a Tiger game? Is that, I think it was. Yeah, is your hands up, Bob?
Yeah,
Bob Frank?
thank you, Rich, for the fine summary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm not nearly as optimistic as you are that the politicians, the election is over. Given the former governor, former president's pursuit to keep the election cycles in question and challenging it. So I just don't see that the election really is over. However, I hope you're right, and I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see that at this time.
Well, I wasn't optimistic this morning, and I probably won't be optimistic tomorrow. But I will say, when I'm with you all, when I'm with the peace group, I get optimistic. We build on each other. That's just the thing to do.
Not only that, but you know, in my personal observation of people, I see a far different kind of people than what is displayed in the news in the news and other publications that comment. So you know, I balance what I'm reading in the various publications as well as what I see on my news hour, which, by the way, I'm not watching it tonight. You know, I've got it recorded, but I'm not going to watch it. I don't. I think all of the commentary about the elections is just creating lots of anxiety, and I don't need that. But getting back to a peaceful world, you know, my personal observation and my contacts with people are far different, and it is a much peaceful world. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't turmoil and all the other, you know, hunger and all that. I'm not denying all that, but I focus oftentimes on my personal experience.
Thank you.
Chuck Kessner, your hand's up. Did you have something else to say, or?
Yeah, Colleen, when Colleen said something, she checked one of my boxes. When they're talking about the election, I don't want to talk about the election, but I'm wondering that if we in the peace movement are missing an opportunity, because a lot of people are talking about this election. They're saying that, you know, the pundits are saying it's really about the economy. You may disagree or agree, but it is an important component to this election. I know we all have other issues we're very concerned about, and they're valid issues, but they're saying, you know, it's either one or two for most of the people in the country. And this war in Ukraine and the mainstream media has not really showed the cost that this is costing us as citizens. I mean, you can make a connection to the gas prices and our embargo of the Soviet Union and their energy. This is costing us, you know, and that trickles on down to the supply chain, you know, and us going to the grocery store. We're paying for this personally. And I'm wondering if that's a missing component. We're not, you know, personalizing. I can't say people are selfish because they're voting on the economy only, but I'm wondering if we in the peace movement could get our act together and maybe more show this, so like how this is really impacting our life here in the United States. This militarism is going to bring this country down one way or the other. And if we don't stop this, and peace it makes financial sense too. And if we could make an argument for that, just a thought, Rich and everybody.
Well, that reminds me of the famous Martin Luther King quote, which goes something like, when a country spends more money on the military than on programs of social uplift, it's approaching spiritual death. We see the death, for example, in the deaths of despair. So many Americans dying from suicide, alcoholism, and opioid misuse. Yes, and we'll have an opportunity, I assume, in the next several weeks with the military budget. It's not been approved for 2023 yet, and usually that happens by the end of the year. Unfortunately, if there's any one thing that Republicans and Democrats in Congress agree upon, it is raising the defense budget. We have our work cut out for us.
If we call that number, yeah, Tom Hartman talks about calling that number that 202-224-3121. We don't have to know anything. We can just tell them where we live and leave, and we don't even have to know the name of our representatives, is the way he puts it, because they'll tell us. They have it there, and then we can leave a message and tell them that we want the talks between Biden and Zelensky and Putin, or whatever we want to tell them. Cut the military budget. Just takes a few minutes to make the call. So if there are no more questions, then I guess we can start our business meeting.
Let me just say thanks to everybody for participating. You've heard me say this before, perhaps. In Roman Catholic theology, one of the virtues is prudentia, which can be described as darn good thinking. I hope you've done some darn good thinking tonight, and then tomorrow do some darn good acting. Thank you, peacemakers. I'm going to be on. Shalom, salam.